How do we talk about crime when this Congress is prepared this year to spend 11 times more for the military than for education?
Bernie Sanders was on CNN where he was comparing his record to Joe Biden's. But then Brooke Baldwin of CNN brought up the fact that both Bernie and Biden voted for the 1994 crime bill. Now, I will break down with video from back then showing you the differences in why Biden, who, by the way, wrote the crime bill, why he supported it compared to why Bernie supported it. But I want to show you this clip because it really exposes the media's inability to have nuanced discussions about these sorts of topics. Watch.
Senator, let me jump in because I hear you on the contrasts, and there are a number of them. But the one thing that both of you voted for and what Joe Biden helped write is the 1994 crime bill. Even former President Bill Clinton, who signed it into law, says it went too far, right? It expanded mandatory minimums. It boosted the nation's prison population. It disproportionately impacted African Americans and Hispanics. So my question to you, Senator Sanders, is do you regret that vote?
Well, let me give you my answer. Go to YouTube today and find out what I said literally
Well, I'm
on the
looking
day
at you
that
right
I voted
now,
for
Senator. Tell me
but,
if you regret
One second. I voted for that bill because it included the Violence Against Women's Act and it included a ban on assault weapons. And Brooke, you would be asking me today, Senator, why did you not vote for a ban on assault weapons? Why did you vote against?
I'm asking you today if you regret your vote.
Sometimes you have legislation which includes very good stuff and very bad stuff. That legislation included very bad stuff. I had to make the choice whether I voted to ban assault weapons, something that I promised the people of Vermont I would. And I also had to vote to make sure that we had a violence against women provision in there. If you see what I said on the floor at that time, I talked about mass incarceration. I talked about capital punishment. So sometimes in the real world, in the Congress, you got big pieces of legislation that have bad stuff, and God knows that legislation had bad stuff. And right now, I'm one of the leaders in the fight for criminal justice reform, so we don't have more people in jail than any other major country on earth.
Now, I'm one guy. CNN has a massive team. They have millions and millions, likely billions of dollars. They could afford to dig up a couple clips and actually compare the differences to what Joe Biden was saying back then on the crime bill to what Bernie Sanders was saying. There is nuance here. Now, look, you can still disagree with Bernie's vote on the crime bill. You can still say, despite the fact that it had the Violence Against Women Act in it, despite the fact that it had a ban on assault weapons, Bernie still should have voted against it. I think that's a fair position to take. Either way, you need to look at the actual facts. To try and paint that Biden and Bernie are the same on this issue, and to then try and cut Bernie off when he's saying, hey, go to YouTube and look at the clips back then, because clearly US CNN are not going to show them, even though you have all this money, all this support, all these resources, you're not willing to actually show what happened back then. The people watching this can do it themselves. So let me show you the actual differences between what Joe Biden said back then on the crime bill and what Bernie Sanders said.
We must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street.
Mr. Chairman, how do we talk about the very serious crime problem in America without mentioning that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world by far, with 22% of our children in poverty and 5 million kids hungry today? Do you think maybe that might have some relationship to crime? How do we talk about crime when this Congress is prepared this year to spend 11 times more for the military than for education? When 21% of our kids drop out of high school, when a recent study told us that twice as many young workers now earn poverty wages as 10 years ago, when the gap between the rich and the poor is growing wider, and when the rate of poverty continues to grow? Do you think maybe that might have some relationship to crime? Mr. Chairman, it is my firm belief that clearly there are people in our society who are horribly violent, who are deeply sick and sociopathic, and clearly these people must be put behind bars in order to protect society from them. But it is also my view that through the neglect of our government and through a grossly irrational set of priorities, we are dooming today tens of millions of young people to a future of bitterness, misery, hopelessness, drugs, crime, and violence. Mr. Speaker, it is disturbing that the death of Nicole Simpson, a tragedy affecting the rich and the famous, should be necessary to force us to take notice of the horror of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, 80% of homicides in Vermont involve domestic partners or family members. All of the 6 women slain in Vermont during 1993 died at the hands of an intimate partner or a family member. Nationally, 3 out of every 10 women who are victims of homicide were murdered by a spouse or an intimate partner, and every 15 seconds, a woman is battered by her husband or a boyfriend. Mr. Speaker, we have 17 programs in Vermont that work with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, and 92% of the people who provide those services are volunteers. These volunteers, most of whom are women, are doing an extraordinary job in counseling and supporting the victims of domestic violence. But they need help. Mr. Speaker, I have a number of serious problems with the crime bill, but one part of it that I vigorously support is the Violence Against Women Act. We urgently need the $1.8 billion in this bill to combat the epidemic of violence against women on the streets and in the homes of America.
So the difference here is rather stark, isn't it? Brooke Baldwin could have showed these clips. They could have been like, yeah, you're right. On the issue of the crime bill, let us show you what Biden said back then and what you said back then. But that's not what CNN does. And you saw that first clip in the corner there. It said it's from CNN Politics. So they have this clip. But maybe they don't have the Bernie clips. I mean, I've watched CNN quite a bit. I have never seen them use an old Bernie clip. Never. And maybe it's because he looks pretty good in them. And I don't just mean his haircut. I mean what he's actually saying. He has been consistent. He is saying the same things back then that he does now about these issues. He's been a fighter the entire time on these issues. Now, again, you can still disagree with his votes on the crime bill. And I think it's possible that he disagrees with his own vote on the crime bill. But he was right to point out that if he had voted against it, they would say, oh, Bernie, why do you hate women? Why did you vote against the Violence Against Women Act? I guess Bernie hates women. He's a sexist. You know they would be doing that. So it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't. Either way, he would have gotten shit for that vote. So this is about, you have to look at what they were saying back then and the intended effect in their minds of the bill. So Biden was completely focused on incarceration, completely focused on locking people up. Bernie Sanders was focused on actually changing society to benefit people, making sure people have health care, making sure people have good paying jobs, because he understands when there is a lack of those elements in your life, you are more likely to get into crime. Bernie is focused on the actual core issues that lead to these sorts of problems. Biden focused completely on incarceration. And you saw there why Bernie voted for the bill, because of the Violence Against Women Act. So again, these differences matter. So even on a vote where they both voted the same way, you can see who actually has empathy and who doesn't.